So the last kind of security I'd like to talk about is OAuth. OAuth is a standard. There's an OAuth and OAuth 2 that's going to allow a developer writing an application to be able to use your service without having to collect the credentials themselves. Basic authentication works really well, except that it leaks the credentials to the developer that actually developed them. So you can imagine if I was building an iPhone app and I wanted to interact with a REST API, I could certainly do that. But if I need to be able to create that basic authentication header, I'm going to need to ask the user to give me their username and password. Now, if I'm a good conscientious developer, I'm going to just pass those along, create the header, and be able to do the work I want to do. There is in some way that the user needs to trust me as a developer because they were willing to put my app on the phone. But to make it so that I don't have to have any of those credentials ever, OAuth was really generated. And let's talk about what that looks like. It's similar to token-based, but there's some extra steps that become crucial in allowing this whole process to work. The developer, like before, requests an API key, and then the service, you, would supply them with an API key and a shared secret, just like before. And then the developer, when they're ready to work with it, they're going to ask you for a request token. This is a token to allow you to ask for the user to be prompted to approve that your API can be used by this application. So it goes ahead and validates the information and returns the token. And again, this token is much like standard token-based development, but this is only to allow them to call into the OAuth service itself. At that point, the token is returned and gives the developer a URI to redirect the user to. In a phone application, they will redirect them to a new URL that the API developer actually owns. The API will display this new UI saying, Bob's app wants you to give permission for Bob's app to be able to access certain parts of the API. They want to be able to look at your diaries. They want to be able to get the summary of your daily consumption, let's say in our case. And once the user approves that, they can go, yeah, I asked for this. This is cool. The API goes, okay, the user said it's okay. It sends a result back to the developer saying, all this was cool, you can now actually request a request token via OAuth. So this allows them to get a token which they can then call the API, and this token, unlike the one we just created, is embedded with the information about the user, so that when this token is used on subsequent calls, it not only knows who the developer is, but it also knows what user the developer is acting on the behest of. So that when that token authentication happens, it knows, okay, not only has Jake's Software Shack successfully called her API, but that Jake's Software Shack is acting as Bob on our website. So when he asks for diaries, we're going to return Bob's diaries. And that's the core of what OAuth does. There's a lot of moving parts here, and this is what has been confusing, but it's actually not that hard to build. Because of time constraints and the state of Web API today, building this by hand, I could do an entire course. I could spend 6 hours building this in front of you. Instead of that, I'm going to punt a little. I'm going to talk about a non-released piece of code. Let's take a look of an OAuth implementation using some code that is not in release form yet. And so I didn't want to have our project depend on it. It doesn't work well with today's version of Web API, but it will work with Web API 2 when it releases. So here in Visual Studio, we're actually looking at the .NET OpenAuth project. This is a project, it's an open source project. You can see at the bottom of the screen a link over to it, and this includes implementations of OAuth 1 and 2 that work with different parts of the .NET framework. In fact, this is the open source project that the ASP.NET MVC team is using to implement things like third-party OAuth registration. When you see someone using ASP.NET MVC and allowing you to log in with your Google, your Facebook, your Microsoft account, this is the project that's allowing that to happen. One of the new features that they have is this ability to become the author of an OAuth implementation. Originally, their primary focus was being the consumer of an OAuth token, so that you could accept the credentials from a third party like Google or Facebook or Microsoft. But now they're supporting the ability to create your own server that's going to pass out OAuth tokens to allow people to call into your service at the behest of other people. So there's a few different pieces here. They have an example in it called the OAuth 2 Protected Web API example. And I would suggest if you need to implement OAuth in your implementation, this is the best place to start. This is a fully featured Web API example, but it's really depending on some new features of Web API. It is tied to pre-release versions of Web API as of the recording of this course. When Web API 2 ships, this will be able to be used full and foremost with that implementation. This is why I'm not implementing it with our walkthrough example, is that it's just not compatible with today's version of Web API. So the trick here is that it has a few pieces that are important. There is a token controller, and the token controller, much like the one we just built, has a simple post method. They're using asynchronous communications, which is not a bad idea to handle a lot of these things asynchronously, but for our needs, I'm not going to go into it too deeply. But they're using something they've built called the authorization server that knows how to handle these requests. When you build your own implementation, you're going to be building parts of this authorization server that know how to store these secrets and how to validate and how to tie to individual users. That's the work you're going to do. When someone gets these tokens that they're being asked for, it's going to redirect them to an individual page, and you would implement this in any technology you want, but they have an example here using Razor and ASP.NET MVC, and this is simply just pops up a form that says, hey, is this what you really want to allow them to do? If you hit approval, then the controller that is called, this user controller, just processes a post to that operation. It looks at this and just looks at the authorization server, looks at the information, and puts together a grant. It essentially just will automatically put together a response that includes a generated token for them and the redirection that is necessary. The last piece, much like what we've built before, so now you have a sense of how you would build these, is they are actually just creating something called a bearer token handler. This is a handler much like what we did, that when operations are done, they're just looking for a special kind of header. You can see here they're looking at the request.headers.authorization.scheme to be bearer, much like we did with basic. If it's bearer, then they're taking the information in that header and then using it to find the current user and to, surprise, surprise, set the current principal to be the current principal of the website. So this is a great place to look. I've sort of hinted at some of the pieces here, but most of what you've learned before are key pieces to the way you would implement OAuth. The harder parts that .NET OpenAuth can help you with is actually building the server and the services that know how to do things with the tokens, how to redirect to the authorization page, to implement the authorization page so that you can confirm that the user actually wants to be able to share this token with a third party, and to accept that token that the third party is using as a bearer authorization header. So let's wrap up this module.